Good evening, everybody. May I call you right? May I call you early for dinner? No, I hope you've eaten, so I don't need to do that. Right. Welcome to the 14th Roundtable Forum at New South Wales Parliament House. This is number 14. We're proud we've lasted that long. It's been up and down, but we haven't given the game away yet, nor have Parliament, nor have you. That's the important thing. This is the 14th in the Roundtable series of public forums on issues of concern to thinking people in our community. That particularly includes you. The sponsoring organisation behind these forums is the Fellowship of the Roundtable, FORT for short, and it's a long-established discussion and study group. The committee told me I don't need to say all this stuff, but I do it for the benefit of people who don't yet know it, and those who already know it can put your fingers in your ears. It's a long-established discussion and study group aiming to raise consciousness on political, social and cultural issues and to network for creative social change. We have no links or connections with any political or business organisation, any religion or any other group in the community whatsoever. We float alone. All funds are spent on printed and internet information and on these public meetings. These public meetings are the most expensive single component, mainly because of catering expenses, etc., but other things too. We believe in the importance of culture, individuality and moral integrity, and in the dignity, value and liberty of each person as the foundation of a just society. Our motto, we serve truth, not consensus. On that basis, we have no intention of being political in the mainstream sense. If you're interested in being kept in touch for future events, or if you're interested in joining the fellowship, then you can fill in one of those forms that Robin has at the table near the door. And if you just want to be kept in touch, that's good. It's also good if you want to offer any ideas for future talks or speakers. Hand it to the Robin at the desk, please. Now, the Roundtable Forum extends a hearty welcome to all of you. The last forum on November the 24th, 2009 was politics and the police, and the previous 12 topics are listed in large print on that sheet of A4 paper at the desk if you want to have a souvenir, nostalgia. It's never like this. We've been going for 4 years here. Tonight's topic as advertised is peak oil. Is this the end of civilization as we know it? And the 4 guest speakers are, in order, Lee Rhiannon, MLC, Peter Driscoll, the Reverend Dr. Gordon Moyes, MLC, and Dr. Gary Glazebrook. And they will speak in that order. Now, our 5th speaker, Ian Cohen, MLC, he won't be available tonight. He has sent his apologies, and questions will be invited when all 4 speakers have finished their presentation, but not until two of our speakers are doing PowerPoint presentations on this very important issue. Now, our first speaker will be Lee Rhiannon, MLC, and Lee is the New South Wales Greens MP responsible for transport. In 2008, she introduced a private member's bill on peak oil, and that was the Peak Oil Response Plan Bill, and she's been pre-selected as the Green Senate candidate for New South Wales in the upcoming 2010 federal election. So welcome, Lee Rhiannon.
I do acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet and pay tribute to their history, their culture and their ongoing contribution to our community. Thanks to the organisers for putting on tonight, and on behalf of the Greens, thanks for the invitation to speak. 2 great challenges of our time are climate change and peak oil, but I think we'd all agree that peak oil is just not getting that same press as climate change, and I think that's interesting to consider why. But to put it into perspective, it's also worth remembering that climate change didn't get much coverage for well over a decade, probably even more, when you consider that there was people sounding warning bells, certainly in the late 80s and the early 90s. And it really wasn't until in a mainstream political sense, it's about the 2007 election when climate change is picked up by the leaders of the major parties. And why they did that was not because all of a sudden John Howard in his last year as Prime Minister or Kevin Rudd as he was opposition leader suddenly became worried about climate change. Quite seriously, it was because of that the public pressure. And that's why I do appreciate events like tonight, because building the awareness around peak oil vulnerability is really critical. As I'm the first speaker, I thought it is worth just setting the scene a little bit in terms of definitions of what we're talking about and how the different players see the issue of the availability of petroleum stocks at the moment. Peak oil is a point in time when the maximum rate of global petroleum production is reached, after which the rate of production will decline with anticipated negative impacts socially and obviously for the economy as well. Well, when I say obviously, I really should have qualified that, because the impacts, I believe, do not have to be so great if we plan for it. And that's certainly something that the Greens advocate very strongly. What we're really talking about here is the end of excessive oil. And in some of the quotes and analysis that I'll go through, I certainly do acknowledge that there's some people who argue that there is huge oil stocks still available. It's just a question to be able to reach them. Now, so just to acknowledge where some of the debate is at about peak oil. Last year, Ian Reid, the head of the European Oil and Gas Research, stated, capacity has pretty much peaked in the sense that decline equals new resources. Now, I want to go through some of these authorities and their different comments on oil availability, because I acknowledge straight up I'm not an expert in this field, so why should you believe me when I say that there is a serious oil vulnerability facing our communities? So I did want to present information from those who work full-time in this area. Dr. Faith Birol, the chief economist of the respected International Energy Association agency in Paris, has actually conducted detailed assessment of more than 800 oil fields in the world, covering 3/4 of global reserves. And he has found that most of the biggest fields have already peaked, and that the rate of decline in oil production is now running at nearly twice the pace as calculated just 2 years ago. So that certainly is a theme that I found when I was going back reading material in preparing for tonight, that so many of the experts in this field are finding that the rate of slowing of production is increasing. The World Energy Outlook is another good source of information in this area. There is already a gap of 1.5 million barrels per day between the World Energy Outlook forecast and actual production. Now, what they've also found is the production growth has fallen 50% short of the forecast growth over the last 2 years. Now, a number of governments, both here and overseas, actually have done some preparations for peak oil. We would argue that not enough, and it's something that I will come into in more detail. But I certainly don't want to give the impression that nothing is being done at all. But a pattern that you do see is that, again, I think it's because of public pressure, that you see that there is some response coming from governments in terms of policy, but not in terms of outcomes out there in real public land. And I'm talking that there, in the case of Australia, there still isn't sufficient money being injected by state and federal governments into public transport, and also the obscene amounts of money going to motorways in this country will just make you think that they actually haven't heard of peak oil. Now, in terms of new supplies, I think it's worth dealing with that issue, because I do find that when this issue is debated, that there usually will, like you've seen with climate deniers, are popping up quite frequently these days, and it's always worth remembering they're people who are largely funded by the fossil fuel industry. You're also finding that there's people who work in this area who will argue that there remains a ready supply of petroleum stocks. Now, I really would urge people to be wary of those arguments because, yes, I'm certainly not disagreeing that there are oil reserves in many places of the world that have not been tapped, but the issue is that it is just plain uneconomical to go after them. And it's a real reminder why we need to have fundamental changes in how our society is organised, because we can't keep relying on this extraordinary period that we've had for the past century about where petroleum has just been the basis of so much of life. Agriculture, transport, even many things that we just take for granted in our life in terms of pharmaceuticals and everyday products. So it's really why we need governments to be on board to working with communities for the change that's required. Again, just sticking with this theme about are there new supplies around, the reality is that the costs would be incredibly high if oil companies, and even if they were backed by governments, to unlock fresh supplies in places like the North Sea and the Gulf of Mexico, where the oil supplies have been so depleted. There are deep water rigs, I acknowledge, off Brazil, and there's certainly some companies that are pushing ahead with incredible technology, but again, it's just not cost effective in terms of solving this problem. And it's again interesting to see who is, some of the key business people and their comments in this area. I read some quotes from Sir Richard Branson, who obviously with his companies would be keeping a close watch on the price of oil because it will affect his business, his air service business. And he said just February this year that the world faces peak oil within 5 years. He said, don't let the oil crunch catch us out in the way that the credit crunch did. So I wanted to share that with you because I think it does underline that what we're talking about is real, it's serious, and it needs to be dealt with. Now, just coming to what is the situation in Australia with regard to peak oil predictions. Earlier this month, the chairman of the Australian Petroleum Production and Exploration Association, Eric Streetberg, predicted peak oil was just 3 years away for this country and forecast prices of up to $200 a barrel. So that's not the Greens saying it, it's not me saying it, it's actually from the chairman of the Australian Petroleum Production and Exploration Association. Almost 1/2 of the oil consumed in Australia is imported, and the petroleum trade deficit already exceeds $12 billion per annum. So we have a real challenge here, and it's one, again, that we would argue governments need to be on board to deal with. Based on the official production and demand forecasts, Australia will need to import approximately 2/3 of its oil by 2015 in a setting of rapidly declining availability and increasing prices in the international markets. Now, Professor, and I apologise if I'm pronouncing these names incorrectly, Professor Kjell Akerlek, President of the Association for the Study of Peak Oil, has stated that Australia's relatively undeveloped public transport system leaves the country more vulnerable to a downturn in energy production. He has said Australia is very sensitive to such developments. And again, I'll come to that in more detail, as the urgency of governments at all levels to be fast-tracking public transport, more friendly cycling facilities, more friendly pedestrian facilities should be a priority. So that leads us to the all-important question, what is Australia doing? Well, we've had a Labor government in power for 2 years, and when you look at some of these key issues, these big issues like climate change, like peak oil, I have to say that the response from federal Labor is disappointing. The Rudd government has not delivered an official energy policy, let alone response plans for peak oil, and that really should be a fundamental from any government. In New South Wales, the government has no plan, or at least no plan that they are public about. And when the Greens put up the bill, peak oil bill that we mentioned earlier, the government, the Labor government and the Liberal opposition voted against it. Now, we would argue that the whole issue of peak oil should be part of the key debates at the moment on a carbon tax, on emissions trading, and certainly factored into the tax review that is going on at the moment. And you sort of guess when the Treasurer makes the vague comments that review is just about finished. Now, my guess is that it won't cover peak oil, but good heavens, it really should. I do congratulate the Australian Association for the Study of Peak Oil and Gas, who have argued that Australia needs to establish a strategic petroleum reserve equivalent to 90 days of oil imports, and have come forward with quite comprehensive plans in how to deal with this issue. And again, if you're interested in pursuing information on this area, their website is worth checking out. Now, the rising price of petrol and other oil products and the decline in these energy supplies will increasingly dominate all the work of all levels of government. Now, at the moment, I'd have to argue that they're not facing up to that, but that will become the reality, and the domination will be even greater if we don't start planning for the transition right now. And we're talking about everything. It's not just transport, it's not just energy, it's food bills, it's construction costs, so many aspects of our day-to-day life. So I would like to just go through with you part of the Greens' response here. 2 years ago in this Parliament, I put forward to the New South Wales Upper House the Greens' peak oil response plan. Now, it was actually I thought it was quite a neat little package and a pretty easy one for governments to support, the government and the opposition to support, but as I said, they didn't. What our plan, our private members bill, would have done was to set up a peak oil task force to inquire into and for it to report on the best strategies to mitigate the impact of peak oil in New South Wales. While that inquiry was going on, we actually said, and this was set out in the bill, that there should be a moratorium on constructing oil-dependent infrastructure. So all the big motorways and and the like shouldn't have been occurring in that period, because from a Greens perspective, we would argue that a responsible plan will come forward with a position that such projects could not be part of a future planning for Australia. And the third aspect of our bill was to require that once the task force had completed its work, the New South Wales Premier would respond to the recommendations by developing a comprehensive action plan. So it was, quite seriously, it was not prescriptive, it was about doing the inquiry and coming forward with a plan. Pretty minimal in the scheme of things, and certainly from a Greens perspective in terms of the urgency of this issue, but we pitched it in that way, hoping we would get the support of other parties. Now, apart from my colleague here, Porter Moyes, the support was just not there for the Greens bill from Labor, the Nationals or the Liberal Party, which was very disappointing. At a federal level, there have been some developments, but they've been minimal. There was a 2007 report of the Senate Rural and Regional Affairs and Transport Committee inquiry. Again, a useful report comes out of that, but it hasn't gone any further. And again, giving great emphasis to the whole issue of public transport. And that's what I would like to speak to you about, that we really do need to move away from the extraordinary dominance cars and trucks have on our lives. More freight should be on rail. We should be ending the construction of urban motorways, and that needs to happen not just in Australia but around the world, because there are alarming developments here. China has actually overtaken the United States as the world's top car market, and that I find quite mind-boggling. And then when you look at the oil demand both in China and in India, they are now outstripping other countries as middle class in those countries grow. And I'm not in any way arguing that their standard of living shouldn't increase. I think it's incredibly important that these countries' standard of living is able to rise. But if we don't again grapple with this issue of oil vulnerability and climate change, we're going to get a widening gap in those societies like we have in our own, between those who have money and wealth and those who don't and do it tough. So in terms of what's happening about this, I've painted a bleak picture in terms of the federal government and the New South Wales government, but there have been some good developments in Australia, and I'm hoping that we'll actually hear a lot more about those tonight. Queensland government's been interesting. There was a minister there, and he who actually lost his seat. Did he lose his seat? No, he's still got his seat. He's not a minister. And he had a real commitment and I believe a real understanding of peak oil, and actually won support within the Queensland government for an oil vulnerability task force, which did excellent work. But and that was partly what we modelled the Greens bill on. But what you found there is the task force does its work, but it was not enacted. And as you would probably be hearing now, there's massive motorway projects right in the heart of Brisbane, many of them these big tunnel projects, which is just scandalous. Like the amount of energy that they eat up is a very serious worry. It's, also there's been good developments with Brisbane City Council, and then in Melbourne, Maribyrnong City Council have come forward with their own action plans. A number of local councils have seen their own councillors raise the need for peak oil plans, but often they're just not getting the numbers. So I just wanted to quickly run through that there are some good developments. Probably the head of the pack is Brisbane City Council, which has recommended a prudent risk management approach with requiring a number of initiatives to be undertaken, and they are the reduction in the consumption of liquid fossil fuels, encouraging the development of alternate fuels, and preparation for demographic changes. And that's largely in terms of more bicycle use, more public transport use. So that plan, again, I think that we largely find great merit in. It's not as advanced as it should be, but I think that it's something that shows great initiative. So I think there's lots that we can be encouraged by, but I think what is really crucial, and it's again why I'm really pleased that tonight is being held, we need to build awareness around this issue. Again, I think we could probably describe peak oil as a bit of a poor cousin to climate change at the moment. That needs to shift, and we need governments, local councils, every level. We need that awareness, so where people are taking initiatives to change their lifestyle, to reduce petroleum use, they're giving support, but also we need governments to drive those big changes in terms of how we travel, how we farm, how we live our lives. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Leah Roman, for that riveting presentation. Our second speaker is Peter Driscoll. Peter Driscoll is a former insurance company executive who co-founded Transition Sydney in 2008 with the aim of supporting and promoting transition initiatives throughout the Greater Sydney region to help local communities meet the challenges of post-peak oil urban living. And Peter Driscoll's presentation will be a PowerPoint presentation. Welcome, Peter Driscoll, please.
Thank you very much. I'm glad I was able to resuscitate the computer while being introduced. Again, I'd like to start by recognising and thanking the Fellowship of the Round Table for choosing this topic, because it is an important one, certainly is to me, and awareness, as Lee has pointed out, does need to be raised for this, the poor cousin of climate change. I am pleased that Lee gave you some good facts and figures and spoke authoritatively on peak oil, because I'm not going to say anything authoritative about peak oil. I'm a layperson. I'm not a petroleum scientist, but I have read a lot about peak oil, and I know I've been around Sydney for the last 18 months or so, doing a lot of presentations where a large part of the presentation was about peak oil. But for the transition movement, which I will talk about, peak oil is just one of the drivers, one of the motivations for taking action. So what I'm going to talk about tonight is are these things that you see on the screen now. Lee mentioned the concept of peak oil being a poor cousin. There are a lot of other poor cousins that I want to talk about as well, because when they all add up, it can get pretty frightening. What I liked about the question was it raises the question of civilisation as we know it. So what is civilisation is a worthy question in itself. If Lee's done her research on peak oil, I've done it on civilisation, and more to the point, how civilisations might collapse. Then I'm going to try and answer that question: is this the end of civilisation as we know it? And then talk about the transition approach to doing something about it. Peak everything. Richard Heinberg from the Post-Carbon Institute wrote a book by this title, and as the title suggests, oil isn't the only thing in our environment that's peaked. Oil, natural gas, coal, soil, forests, water. I'll go back to that one. Minerals, biodiversities, whole species. There's a whole range of depletions going on on a global basis. We've seen individual parts of the world run out of usable soil, run out of water, run out of oil, run out of various individual resources. But there's always been the ability to bring them in from another place to support local communities. Now we're starting to get close to some global peaks for a lot of these resources that, in fact, our lives and our civilization depends on. So I'm moved to say that peak oil is one of the easy ones. There are a lot of other ones that we'll have to face in the decades ahead. So what is civilisation? A good question. Well, it seems that there are certain pillars of civilisation, certain things that people would agree makes the difference between a small tribe of nomadic hunter-gatherers moving about a landscape, staying nowhere for long, not being able to form into any larger group of people, dependent on moving to find new sources of food. That's the traditional primitive hunter-gatherer style of existence. And civilisation is a concept that contrasts with that. And this cloud, if you like, has a number of items on it that are suggested as indicators of civilisation. There are some primary ones and some secondary ones. The primary ones you see in that cloud are, as you would expect, agriculture. Because agriculture, a way of producing food in a location other than wandering about hunter-gathering, is obviously one of the very basic things that underpins civilisation. Urbanism, people grouping together into permanent settlements, is another one of the concurrent characteristics that leads to a definition of a civilisation. The others are trade, because obviously an agglomeration of people in one area is unlikely to be able to produce everything that it needs for hopefully its improving quality of life. So trade with other areas where goods are exchanged is another one of these fundamental things. Specialised occupations is another one of the fundamental ones. Not everyone doing everything, but people specialising in certain things. And transport, obviously trade and transport are fundamental. If you're going to trade goods with another settlement in a distant place or a not too distant place, you need some form of transport. And all of those things together are your basics. Around that you get the additional secondary indicators of writing, architecture, language, governance, norms and legal systems and so on. So if we look at those primary pillars of what is a civilisation, and in those secondary ones, it's a good segue, a good lead into asking, well, okay, if they're the pillars, well, how do they collapse? And this next slide looks at that question, how do they collapse? And I'm quoting from a book by Jared Diamond here called Collapse, How Societies Choose to Fail or Succeed. And you'll see here a somewhat long list, I hope you can read it. There's a lot of environmental factors there, environmental collapse, of deforestation, soil problems, water, over hunting, over fishing, effects of introduced species, and so on and so forth. It's a bit of a long list. And certainly societies have collapsed when the environment around them has failed to continue to support them. Many over history have collapsed as a basis of largely environmental changes. The other set of factors is societal, is conflict, its lack of trading partners, and its lack of decent response to the environmental problems. Now, Easter Island was a classic case that's often used by the archaeologists, where they cut down all the trees to roll these big stones to make their statues, but after they cut down all the trees, their soil, was eroded, their climate changed, and they were out of business. So that was the Easter Island story. The other one, the building you see at the bottom, is current day, and that's Detroit in the States, where vast areas have just been abandoned. Vast areas of housing have been abandoned because Detroit has almost died as a result of the global financial crisis and the economic downturn that's gone along with that. So here we've seen an economic a crisis, an economic collapse, temporary maybe, we all hope it is, but there's two views about that, having an impact on a particular area that's quite devastating because it was dependent on a particular form of economic activity.